I never imagined that a single phone call, at 10:47 on a Friday night, would be the moment my entire life quietly changed direction. I was Thomas, Junior Operations Manager at Callaway & Pierce, and my boss, Jessica Callaway, was the kind of woman who made boardrooms go silent just by walking in. She never said good morning. She rarely said good anything, so when her name lit up my phone that night, my stomach did something it had no business doing. I answered. Her voice was clipped, controlled, like always. "Thomas, my car won't start. I need you to drive me somewhere now. No please, no explanation. Just the expectation that I would move, and I did. 40 minutes later, we were on a dark highway heading toward the edge of the city, where the houses stopped looking like houses and started looking like statements. She stared out the window the entire time. Silent, still, and then, just as the iron gates of a massive estate appeared through the windshield, she turned to me. Her voice, for the very first time, had something fragile in it. "Thomas, I need you to pretend to be my boyfriend." I almost drove off the road. I didn't answer immediately. I just sat there, both hands on the wheel, staring at those iron gates as they slowly swung open, as if the estate itself had been expecting us. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "You need me to what?" Jessica didn't repeat herself. She simply straightened in her seat, smoothed the front of her coat with both hands, and lifted her chin the way she always did before walking into a room she intended to own. "You heard me, Thomas." "I heard the words," I said carefully. "I'm still working on whether they make sense." She turned to look at me then, and I saw something I had never seen on her face in 3 years of working under her. Not anger, not impatience. Something far more unsettling, desperation. It lasted only a second. Then the mask returned. "Pull up to the front entrance," she said, "and please try not to look like someone who irons their shirts in the dark." I almost smiled. Almost. The driveway alone was longer than my entire street. Manicured hedges lined both sides like silent soldiers standing at attention. Warm golden light spilled from every window of the mansion ahead. 3 floors of old money and older expectations. I parked. Neither of us moved. "Jessica." I said her name without the title for the first time. It felt strange, like stepping onto ice and not knowing if it would hold. "Why?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers, usually so composed, pressed flat against her knees. "Because my father has guests inside that house tonight," she said, "and one of those guests is a man I have never met, but am apparently supposed to marry." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. "An arranged marriage," I said slowly. "My father prefers to call it a strategic alliance." The bitterness in her voice was razor thin but unmistakable. "I prefer to call it a cage with a dinner setting." I looked at her. Really looked at her, maybe for the first time outside of a conference room. She was still staring straight ahead, jaw set, eyes fixed on the front door of that mansion like she was preparing to walk into battle. And I realized she was. "Okay," I said. She blinked, turned to me. "Okay, I'll do it." Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't quite relief. It was more complicated than that, like someone who had braced for a fall and hadn't hit the ground yet. "Don't make it strange, Thomas." "Me," I said, opening the car door. "You're the one who just recruited her employee as a romantic prop at 10 o'clock at night." 11, she corrected quietly, stepping out onto the gravel. "Right. Much more reasonable at 11. She shot me a look, but the corner of her mouth just barely moved. We walked up the stone steps together, side by side. The front door opened before we even reached it, pulled back by a staff member in a pressed uniform who greeted Jessica with a practiced smile and a slight bow. And then he appeared, Jessica's father. Richard Callaway stood in the doorway like he had been carved from the same stone as the mansion itself. Tall, silver-haired, eyes that didn't welcome, they assessed. He looked at Jessica first, then his gaze moved, slowly, deliberately, to me. It was the kind of look that took a man apart piece by piece and decided his worth before he ever opened his mouth. "Jessica," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once been told no. She stepped forward, took my arm, her grip firm, her fingers cool against my sleeve, and without a single tremor in her voice, she said, "Dad, this is Thomas, my boyfriend." Richard Callaway's eyes didn't widen, they narrowed, and something told me this night had only just begun. The inside of the Callaway mansion was exactly what I expected, and nothing I was prepared for, High ceilings, dark wood paneling, oil portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share Richard Calloway's talent for looking at you like you owed them something. A chandelier hung above the entrance hall that probably cost more than my car, my apartment, and my next 3 years of salary combined. I kept my face neutral. Jessica's grip on my arm didn't loosen. Richard led us through to a sitting room where 2 other people were already waiting. An older woman, Jessica's mother, I assumed with kind eyes and careful posture, and a man roughly my age, sitting with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged in a room, the arranged suitor. He stood when we entered. Tall, well-dressed, wearing a smile that was perfectly calibrated. Warm enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to be strategic. "Jessica," he said smoothly, "it's wonderful to finally." "This is Thomas," Jessica said, cutting through his greeting like a blade through silk. "My boyfriend," she said it again with the same steadiness, as if repetition could make it architecture. The man, whose name I would later learn was Daniel, absorbed this with remarkable composure. His smile didn't falter. His eyes simply moved to me with a calm, measuring interest that reminded me uncomfortably of her father. I extended my hand. "Thomas, good to meet you." He shook it, his grip was precise. "Daniel Whitmore, you as well." Richard said nothing. He simply gestured toward the sitting area, and we all took our places. A perfectly arranged scene that felt less like a family gathering and more like a negotiation with furniture. The first hour was a performance. Jessica and I had no rehearsed story, no agreed backstory, no script. We were improvising on a stage built by decades of wealth and expectation, with an audience that included one man actively trying to dismantle everything we presented, her father. He asked questions the way a lawyer cross-examines a witness, casually, almost warmly, but with a precision that made every answer feel like evidence. "Thomas, where did you 2 meet?" "At work," I said simply. "He's in operations," Jessica added, her tone carrying just enough affection to be convincing. "Operations," Richard repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it lacking. Under the coffee table, Jessica's knee pressed lightly against mine, a small signal. "Hold steady." I did, but it was the quieter moments, the ones between questions, where something unexpected began to happen. When Jessica reached across to adjust the collar of my jacket, her fingers lingered half a second longer than necessary. When I leaned toward her to say something low and private, a joke about the portrait above the fireplace looking suspiciously like a disappointed version of her, she turned her face toward mine and laughed. A real one. Quiet and sudden, like something she hadn't planned to let out. Her mother noticed. She smiled into her teacup. "You seem comfortable together," her mother said softly. Jessica looked at me. There was a question in her eyes that had nothing to do with the act. "We argue constantly," I said honestly. "But somehow it works." Jessica's expression flickered. Something between amusement and something more fragile. "He's not wrong," she said quietly. And for just a moment, the performance fell away. Not dramatically, not with any grand announcement. Just quietly, like a coat slipping from someone's shoulders when they finally feel warm enough to let it go. I saw her then. Not my boss. Not the woman who had once returned my entire quarterly report, with a single word written across the top in red ink. Insufficient, but someone who was tired of being managed and arranged and decided for. Someone who just wanted to choose. I looked away before she could see that I understood, but I think, somehow, she already knew. Dinner was served at a table long enough to feel like a statement. Crystal glasses. Silver cutlery arranged with mathematical precision. Candles that burned without flickering, as if even the flames in this house knew better than to be unpredictable. I sat beside Jessica. Daniel sat across from us. Richard occupied the head of the table like a judge behind a bench, and Jessica's mother, whose name I had learned was Eleanor, moved through the meal with the quiet grace of a woman who had spent decades softening the edges of her husband's world. It was during the second course that Richard set down his fork with the deliberate care of someone about to say something they had been constructing for hours. "Thomas," he began, "tell me, how long have you and Jessica been together?" 8 months, Jessica answered before I could. I nodded. 8 months. Richard's eyes moved between us with clinical interest. "And yet," he said, "this is the first time she has ever mentioned you." The table went quiet. I felt Jessica's hand find mine beneath the white linen. Her fingers were cold. Jessica has always kept the things she values most very close, I said. I took it as a compliment. Eleanor smiled. Richard did not. Daniel refilled his wine glass and said nothing, which somehow felt louder than anything else in the room. It was after dinner, while Richard and Daniel moved to the study and Eleanor disappeared into the kitchen, that Jessica finally let the composure crack. Just slightly. Just enough. She found me standing near the tall window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the dark garden below. She came and stood beside me, close enough that I could hear the slow, controlled rhythm of her breathing, the kind of breathing that takes effort. "You're doing well," she said quietly. "I'm terrified," I replied. A soft sound escaped her, not quite a laugh. Something more honest than that. "Join the club," she said. We stood in silence for a moment. Outside, the garden lights cast long shadows across the lawn. Somewhere in the house, the low murmur of male voices. Her father, Daniel, drifted through the walls. "How long has he been planning this?" I asked. She didn't pretend not to understand. 2 years, she said. "The Whitmore family and ours have had a business relationship for a long time. Daniel is the natural conclusion of that relationship, apparently." She paused. "My father has never quite grasped the difference between a merger and a marriage." I turned to look at her profile. The candlelight from the corridor caught the line of her jaw, the tension she was carrying in her shoulders. "Did you ever consider just telling him no?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became an answer. "Every single day," she finally said, "and every single day, I watch how he looks at me when I disappoint him, and I think maybe it's easier to just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Disappear into it," I finished softly. She turned to look at me then, and there was something in her eyes, not gratitude exactly, but the particular relief of being understood by someone you hadn't expected to understand you. "Thomas," she said, and my name in her voice sounded different here than it ever did in the office. Softer, less like a summons. "Why did you agree to this tonight?" "Really?" I considered lying. It would have been easier. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But I think the reason is becoming clearer." She held my gaze for one long suspended moment, and then Daniel's voice came from somewhere down the corridor, calling her name, easy and entitled, and the moment dissolved. She straightened. The mask returned, but her hand just before she turned away brushed lightly against mine. And I stood there at that dark window wondering how something so small could feel so significant. I should have seen it coming. Richard Calloway did not get to where he was by being patient. He was a man who identified obstacles early and removed them quietly, before they had the chance to become inconvenient, and I, Thomas, junior operations manager, son of a school teacher and a mechanic, was very clearly an obstacle. It happened after 11. The house had settled into a deceptive calm. Eleanor had retired for the evening with a gentle smile and a warmth that felt almost apologetic. Daniel had excused himself to take a call. Jessica was freshening up somewhere upstairs, and Richard Calloway appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where I had been waiting and said, without any preamble, "Walk with me, Thomas." It wasn't an invitation. His study was a room that had been designed to make a man feel small. Dark shelves lined every wall, heavy with leather-bound books that looked read not for pleasure but for leverage. A desk the size of a small country sat at the center. He didn't sit behind it. Instead, he moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the grounds below. He let the silence stretch, deliberately. It was a technique. I recognized it because Jessica used the same one in difficult meetings. I wondered if she had learned it from him, or if it was simply something that lived in the blood of people accustomed to power. "You seem like an intelligent man," he finally said. "Thank you," I replied. That wasn't entirely a compliment. He turned from the window. His eyes found mine with the precision of a scope finding its target. "Intelligent men understand context, Thomas. They understand when they are in a situation that is beyond their depth." I kept my expression even. "I'm a reasonable swimmer." Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement, a recalibration. "My daughter," he said, his voice dropping to something quieter and therefore more dangerous, "has a future that has been carefully considered, carefully constructed." The Whitmore family represents a union that would secure not just Jessica's financial future, but the legacy of everything I have spent my life building. He paused. I will not allow that to be disrupted by a convenience. The word landed like a slap dressed as a whisper. With respect, Mr. Calloway, I said. That sounds like a decision Jessica should be making for herself. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Jessica is emotional. She always has been. She makes decisions based on feeling rather than foundation. It is a flaw I have spent years trying to correct. He took a step toward me. Daniel Whitmore is stable, established. He comes from a world Jessica understands. You, his gaze moved over me slowly, deliberately, are a pleasant distraction at best. I said nothing, because the anger rising in my chest was not the kind I could afford to release in this room. I'm going to be straightforward with you, he continued. Whatever this is, whatever she has convinced herself she feels, it will not survive my disapproval. It never has. He moved back toward the desk and picked up a glass of bourbon that had been waiting there. I am asking you, man to man, to consider whether pursuing this is genuinely in Jessica's best interest, or simply in yours. He took a slow sip, watching me over the rim, and then Daniel appeared in the study doorway. As if on cue, as if he had been waiting just outside, and smiled that perfectly measured smile. Richard, he said smoothly, Jessica is asking for Thomas. Richard's eyes didn't leave mine. Of course she is, he said quietly. I held his gaze for one more moment. Then I turned and walked out of that study. My hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. And somewhere between that doorway and the corridor, I stopped asking myself whether my feelings for Jessica were real. Because the fury I felt on her behalf answered that question completely. I found her at the top of the staircase. She was standing with her back against the wall, arms crossed. Not in the defensive way she carried herself at the office, but in the way of someone holding themselves together from the outside because the inside had started to loosen. She looked at my face and knew immediately. He spoke to you, she said. Not a question. He did. Her eyes closed briefly. Thomas? I'm sorry, whatever he said. He called me a pleasant distraction, I said. And then Daniel appeared in the doorway like a stage cue, which tells me that conversation was choreographed well in advance. She let out a slow breath. That's my father. He loves you, I said, in the only way he knows how, which happens to be completely wrong. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully name, like she was seeing something she had been afraid to look at directly. We went back downstairs. The dining room had been reset. Dessert plates, fresh candles, the performance continuing as if the interval had never happened. Richard was already seated. Daniel was already smiling. And then Richard, with the timing of a man who had planned the entire evening like a chess match, leaned back in his chair and said it. Jessica, I think it's time we were all honest with each other. The room temperature seemed to drop. This young man, Richard said, nodding toward me with the kind of civility that is indistinguishable from contempt, arrived here tonight unannounced, unvetted, and, if I'm being candid, unconvincing. He folded his hands on the table. So I'll ask you directly in front of everyone, is this relationship real? Or is this another one of your attempts to avoid a conversation you find uncomfortable? Jessica's mother set down her fork quietly. Daniel watched with patient, practiced stillness, and Jessica, my boss, the woman who had once reduced a senior partner to silence with a single sentence, sat completely still. I watched her, watched the war happening behind her eyes. The daughter who had been measured and found insufficient 1,000 times. The woman who had built an empire of composure to survive this house. She opened her mouth, and I don't know what she was going to say. I don't know if she was going to fold, offer some graceful retreat, protect herself the way she always had by going cold and pulling back, because I spoke first. It's real, I said. Everyone looked at me. I know what I look like to you, Mr. Calloway. I know I don't come with the right name or the right background or the right family legacy, and I know that matters to you. I understand why it matters to you. I paused, letting the words settle before I continued. But what I feel for your daughter is not a convenience. It is not a distraction, and it is not something that began tonight. The room was absolutely silent. Somewhere between 3 years of arguments and returned reports, and 7 a.m. emails that made me question every career choice I'd ever made. I glanced at Jessica, and something broke open in my chest at the look on her face. I fell in love with the most impossible, infuriating, extraordinary woman I have ever met. Jessica's eyes were bright. Her hands were flat on the table, and I could see them trembling. "You can question my background," I said, returning my gaze to Richard. "You can question my intentions, but do not question whether she deserves to choose." Silence then, quietly, with a steadiness that cost her something. Jessica reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm not marrying Daniel," she said. Her voice was calm, final, the voice she used when a decision had already been made and the discussion was over. She looked at her father. "I'm sorry, Dad, but I'm not." Richard Calloway said nothing. For the first time all evening, he had nothing to say. And Daniel, to his credit, simply nodded once. As if somewhere beneath the strategy, he had always known. We left the mansion just past midnight. The iron gates closed behind us with a low, heavy sound. And somehow in the quiet that followed, the world felt different. Lighter. Like a pressure that had been building for hours had finally slowly begun to release. We sat in the car for a moment before I started the engine. Neither of us spoke. The dashboard lights cast a soft glow across Jessica's face, and I watched her breathe, slow and deliberate. The way you breathe when you've just said something that cannot be unsaid, and you're still deciding how you feel about that. "Are you all right?" I asked. She considered the question seriously. "I think so." A pause. "Ask me again in the morning." "I'll add it to my calendar," I said. 7 a.m. Check if boss is emotionally intact. She turned to look at me and laughed. A real one, full and unguarded. The kind I had only heard once before tonight and had already decided was my favorite sound. "Thomas," she said, when the laughter had settled into something quieter. "Jessica, what you said in there." She stopped. Started again. "You didn't have to do that. I know. But you did. I know that too." She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees lining the dark driveway, and the leaves caught the moonlight and released it. "Was any of it true?" she asked softly. "What you said to my father." I held her gaze. Every word. Her breath caught just slightly. Just enough. She reached across and took my hand where it rested on the gear shift. Her fingers were still cool, but they held on. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "For 3 years of impossible, infuriating," I offered. "That too." "And extraordinary," I added. She smiled, and this time she didn't look away. I started the engine, and somewhere on that dark road back toward the city, with her hand still in mine and the radio playing something low and unhurried, the distance between who we had been and who we were becoming quietly, irrevocably closed. 2 years later, the morning light came through the kitchen window in long, golden strips, the kind that make ordinary things look like they belong in a painting. I was at the stove. Eggs, toast, 2 cups of coffee, one with too much sugar, one without. I had stopped needing to ask which was which a long time ago. I heard her before I saw her, the soft sound of footsteps. Then arms, her arms, sliding around me from behind, her cheek pressing between my shoulder blades. "You're up early," she murmured. "You have a 7 a.m. call," I said. "I checked your calendar." A pause. "Then you checked my calendar. Somebody has to." She came around to face me, still in the soft morning version of herself, the one the boardroom never saw. Hair loose, eyes unhurried, a quiet smile that she no longer tried to hide. On her left hand, a simple ring caught the morning light. She reached past me and took her coffee, leaned against the counter, looked at me the way she had looked at me that night at the dark window in her father's house, like something she hadn't planned on but was no longer afraid of. "Thomas," she said. "Jessica, thank you. For that night." I looked at her, this woman who had once written insufficient across my work in red ink, who had made me question every career choice I'd ever made, who had turned to me in a dark car at the gates of her father's world and asked me to stand beside her. "Thank you," I said, "for the order." She laughed, and the morning held us there, in that kitchen, in that light, in that life we had chosen, quietly, completely, and without any reservations at all. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever stood at a doorstep and chosen courage over comfort, tell me about it in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to hear that love sometimes arrives dressed as an argument, share this with them. I'll see you in the next one.